Welcome. My name's Ben, and I'm very lucky to be speaking today with Professor Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski, European Civilisation Chair at the College of Europe Natolin Campus, about the context of my poem, The Bandarist Grows Old. Richard, thanks very much for being here and for speaking with me.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you about your excellent poem, Ben.
Thank you. So the poem's title, The Bandarist Grows Old, it refers to a very specific moment in European history. I was wondering, could you possibly tell us what a Bandarist was and what they were fighting for, what their movement was about?
Yeah, well, the name Bandarist, or Banderowiec in Polish, Banderiwiec in Ukrainian, or Banderowiec in Russian, is a pejorative name. It is not usually used by the people that others identify as Banderovci. It refers to members of the radical nationalist organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the radical faction of that, as well as to those who fought in the Ukrainian insurgent army, the UPA. During the Second World War and immediately afterwards. And the name comes from the leader of the radical faction, Stepan Bandera, who has therefore, in the eyes of their critics, come to be associated with his supporters. Now, the aim of this radical nationalist faction and this insurrectionary army was the creation of an independent Ukrainian nation state in what they considered to be Ukrainian national territory. And they had no scruples in using any means to bring that about.
That leads on quite well to the next question, really, which is, could you tell us a bit about this conflict, the actual conflict, so where it took place? We're talking about, obviously, the borderlands here between Poland and Ukraine. What form did the violence take? Because the poem, I try to suggest violence without the graphic horror of it. And you could talk a bit about that. That'd be fascinating.
The violence was pretty horrific, and all sorts of symbolic aspects were attached to the profanation of human bodies. It originated in this radical nationalist movement, which was directed against the Polish state and against the Polish minority in areas with a Ukrainian ethnic majority, in what was then the southeast of Poland and what is now the southeast or southwest of Ukraine, the provinces known as Volhynia and Galicia. When the Second World War came, the Ukrainian nationalist movement was, like the Polish elites, persecuted by the Soviet state, went underground. There were hopes for cooperation with Nazi Germany to create a Ukrainian state after the German invasion of what had then become the Soviet Union as Western territories in June 1941, but this came to nothing. However, the radical Ukrainian nationalists were active in helping the Germans to kill most of the Jewish population of the area and to establish their authority in these parts. So there is participation in the Holocaust, which provides some experience for the campaign that the Ukrainian insurgent army unleashed against the Polish inhabitants of this area, the Polish minority in this area, although, of course, in particular places they could form the majority. And this is usually described as an action of ethnic cleansing on a mass scale. The conservative estimates for the number of people killed are about 80,000 or so, although they can go much higher. But Poles tend to call this an act of genocide, and I suppose it would fit into the legal definition of genocide if you think that's a particularly helpful way to explain this kind of ethnic conflict. Ukrainians tend to see this as an episode in a violent and long-standing war between Poles and Ukrainians in which everyone got killed, and conservative estimates would be that about 30,000 Ukrainians were killed in retaliatory actions by the Polish resistance or by Poles organizing themselves for self-defense. However, it is worth remembering that Bandera himself was imprisoned at the time and had nothing to do with it. Although he was regarded as the sort of the leader of the movement. The person who was in charge and almost certainly did give the orders for the coordinated massacre of Poles in their villages was Roman Szuchewicz.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Then at the end of the, if I may just
No,
continue
please,
for a minute.
please go ahead.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Then as the war drew to a close, it was obvious that the Red Army was going to win. The Ukrainian insurgent army continued the struggle against the Red Army for an independent Ukraine, occasionally even cooperating with some radical Polish nationalist groups against the Red Army, before a small number sort of fought their way through through Czechoslovakia in order to end up in exile in Germany after the Second World War. They also continued the struggle against the post-war Polish communist state and the Polish army in what became then the southeast corner of Poland. And this led to the expulsion of the Ukrainian population of those areas in what is known as Operation Vistula.
Oh, gosh. That's fascinating. That leads very on to something else I wanted to ask you, which is this poem is written from some imagined future point in which a partisan has grown old and is celebrated as a nation builder in a new Ukraine forged after 1945. Could you perhaps talk a bit about, and you've touched on this already, I mean, Ukraine saw this event very differently as part of its history from Poland. And as a country that was reformed after the war and wasn't entirely independent, it had very different interpretations on this bloodshed. And does this event still affect Polish-Ukrainian relations today? Is it something that's still relevant?
Oh, yes, it does affect Polish-Ukrainian relations today. It affects them very badly, but I'll come to that in a minute. Mm-hmm. In the first place, to say that Ukraine was reformed after the war and it wasn't entirely independent, well, that would be a rather euphemistic description of Poland, but it's not really appropriate to Ukraine. Ukraine was simply turned into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It was larger than the pre-war Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic because it expanded into territories that had been part of the southeastern corner of pre-war Poland. And it was one of the Soviet republics governed by a local communist elite, but very much under orders from Moscow. Any expression of Ukrainian nationalism, particularly in the troublesome western part of the Soviet Republic, was clamped down upon, and former Bandarovцы or former members of the Ukrainian insurgent army or former members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists were persecuted, in some cases extremely severely. It was only really in the 1980s, with the relaxation of Soviet control in Western Ukraine, the growth of a dissident movement, that we see the conditions in which you get a renewed strength of Ukrainian nationalism. And this has meant that there are two conflicting narratives about the Second World War in today's Ukraine. In the west of Ukraine, particularly in the city of Lviv, in the provinces of Galicia and Volhynia, in other words, those parts that were part of Poland before the Second World War. Then we have a narrative where UPA, the Ukrainian insurgent army, are the freedom fighters fighting against all comers for an independent Ukraine. They are the heroes and they are celebrated in the popular culture of Western Ukraine. And Bandera himself has become very much a sort of a popular hero, for example, among the fans of the football club Karpaty Lviv. On the other hand, in eastern Ukraine, you had the tradition of the Great Patriotic War. Huge numbers of Ukrainians from the east fought with the Red Army against the Germans, and many of those people do not really like to be told that they were on the wrong side in the Second World War. And so we have attempts in Ukraine today to try and create a single master narrative, usually involving the victory of the Western Ukrainian narrative over the Eastern Ukrainian narrative, but that is a project that has not yet been found with universal acceptance all over Ukraine. Attempts to do so, of course, play into the hands of the Kremlin in its efforts to describe all Ukrainians as rabid, ultra-nationalist fascists, Bandarovцы, in other words. Now, although Poland and Ukraine now have a common interest in resisting their common enemy in neo-imperial Russia, nevertheless, the fact that you have an unacknowledged or a reluctantly half-acknowledged mass slaughter of Poles by Ukrainian nationalists, the very Ukrainian nationalists that are most involved in the fight against the Kremlin, it has to be said, makes things extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah.
On the Polish side, there is a reluctance to see this particular appalling slaughter in a longer context of relations between Poles and Ukrainians, in which, on the whole, the Poles were the dominant party, had the upper hand, and had more opportunity to do harm to Ukrainians than Ukrainians had an opportunity to do harm to them.
Yes.
On the other hand, on the Ukrainian side, there is a tendency to emphasize this long history of sort of Polish oppression, domination, persecution, which, of course, sort of contextualizes the Volhynian slaughter of 1943 and the Galician slaughter of 1944 to the extent that it's sort of just one episode among many in a bloody history in which the Poles have done more harm to Ukrainians than Ukrainians have done harm to Poles.
That's absolutely fascinating, and that's a really wonderfully concise and interesting introduction into the poem. Thank you very much for your thoughts, your considerations, and for your time, Richard. It's been really fascinating.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's been a pleasure, and congratulations again on a splendid and thought-provoking poem.
The Bandarist grows old. It is summer in his Lviv, and every year he feels it more acutely through papery skin, as if his body is reducing under daylight. His life is regular now, shrunken into a point. He doesn't feel the need to wash his hands before dinner, where he regularly eats 4 potatoes, a carrot, a roll of bread. Watch, he cuts the fish expertly, slitting it smoothly from neck to navel. The knife is sharp, always. There is no space between the borders of his days for unnecessary movement, for questions, for debate. Often, in his old age, he forgets his glasses, and if you asked him now where to dig, he doubts he'd remember. His neighbours know he is one of the heroes, last of the nation builders in a country where everyone has seen blood and no one asks the other whose it was. He likes the sound of cats purring and afternoon traffic, just sitting and letting thoughts drift back to a tree, a village, a courtyard, the well, sunshine, the rope, the axe. And what happened there?